We met Roman in one of the capital's editorial offices, where I worked after the institute. At that time, a lot of night shifts fell to my lot, and Roman lived in the Moscow region, and sometimes, when his work at some event ended late, he came to spend the night at the editorial office. Here he worked quietly for 2-3 hours, making a report, and then he took a can of coffee and came to me, and we chatted until the subway opened. He was quite satisfied with such a schedule. Our superiors also had nothing against it. On one such night, we talked about mysterious, spirit-inhabited houses with a creepy reputation, of which, as you know, there are a great many in the capital. It was then that Roman told me the story that happened directly to him. Then the story will be on his behalf. In the 90s, I worked for a recently appeared newspaper. I won't name it, it's still coming out now. We wrote about everything about sports, pop, travel, spiritual practices and the mysteries of history. At first we did not have our own premises, and we rented the corner from one of the condos of the Soviet magazine. The conditions were so-so. In those years, newly opened organizations were usually housed in hastily adapted rooms for work, in rebuilt kindergartens, hotels, and so on. Then our business went uphill, and we moved to a brand new, newly built office center. Probably one of the first. It was located in the north of the capital and was incredibly cool at that time. Imagine we used to huddle in cramped offices with ever-blinking lamps, cracked window frames, creaking parquet. We didn't have enough space for printers and copiers, we didn't have enough phones, sockets. And where we moved to, it was like in a foreign movie. A common room divided into small booths for employees, each with its own table, to which wires for a telephone and a computer were connected, plastic windows with tinted glass all over the wall, a chic meeting room, and it still smelled of renovation. We occupied an entire floor, and there was no one else besides us. Everyone really liked the new office, especially me, because it was exactly 17 minutes on foot from the house where I rented a room. Well, 18 if you had to wait at a traffic light. But in the editorial office I had my own computer and internet, and at home I had a hard-drinking hostess. It's not surprising that I often spent the night in the office, since neither the guards nor the boss were against it. The first alarm bell sounded about 2 months after our arrival. The chief called me to his office and said that the cleaners complain about me. I come to the office at night in dirty shoes, the carpet can't be cleaned after me. I was surprised. Of course, I led a rather stressful lifestyle. I happened to go down into abandoned ventilation shafts, and into depots, and climb into the attics of high-rise buildings in search of stories for reports. It also happened to be late, but in this case I took a shift with me in my backpack. And besides, 2 quiet Uzbek women worked as cleaners for us. They wouldn't complain without a good reason. I went to see where I had inherited. It turned out that in the lobby, in front of the elevator, there were indeed footprints, as if someone had walked in shoes stained with fresh concrete. But that night, when the traces appeared, I did not come to the editorial office, and the security confirmed it. Then I would like to pay attention to the strangeness of these tracks. They were turned with their heels to the columns. There were 2 rows of columns in the lobby of our building. But my mind was busy with other things. The second bell is my old friend, Yojin Ruslan. He lived almost year-round in India, rarely came home for a short time. During one of these visits, I picked him up for a consultation on one of my articles about yoga practices. We agreed to meet at the editorial office. I told him how to find me. Ruslan called from a payphone. Almost no one had cell phones then, but almost everyone had cards for payphones, and asked to get out. He said he would not cross the threshold of this building. I was a little surprised and amused, but I have long been used to Ruslan's oddities, so we sat down in a cafe and talked. At parting, I asked him what was wrong with our office center. "Don't you feel it?" He asked. No. "And what?" Ruslan just smiled condescendingly and muttered something about my usual stupidity. It was not offensive. I really am not able to feel any emanations that my friend could easily distinguish. There is no place for highly spiritual and sensitive people in journalism, A completely different sense of smell is needed here. In addition, his lifestyle with constant meditations and various spiritual practices slightly moved his already shaky roof. I thought so. There was a third bell, just like before the beginning of the play. It was a sunny morning, at the very beginning of work. I was sitting in my seat, looking through the gossip column, when suddenly a heart-rending scream, that is, a screech, was heard at the other end of the hall. A very loud female squeal, immediately cut off. Everyone immediately jumped up from their seats, rushed to where it came from. A young employee screamed. I worked with her. Completely adequate and brave girl was now sitting in front of the computer, with her eyes squeezed shut and all white. We began to slow her down. She silently pointed at the screen. Nothing special was observed on the screen. Some ancient Windows was loading, either 95 or 3.11. The girl burst into tears, but did not open her eyes. Tears flowed from under her closed eyelids. They took her to the toilet to calm her down. Something was dripped into a plastic cup with water. Finally, she moved away enough that she could tell everything. I turned on the computer, and it first booted up as usual. And then he stopped, and she looked at me. Such a terrible face. In full screen, as if alive. Only dead. Then she began to shake, and the tears began to fall again. They called a computer scientist, as we then called the person who performed the duties of the sysadmin. He brought some floppy disks and rustled them for a long time looking for viruses. He said that he had heard and read about it. A virus whose screensaver is an unexpectedly scary picture that pops out. I don't remember if he found something or not, but he restarted the computer several times. Everything was fine. Then he walked through our machines with his floppy disks, and at lunch, he gave us a small lecture at the request of the general on how not to catch the virus. I still came to the office at night from time to time. I guess I'm really dumb, but it was only to my advantage. After all, I had to communicate with a variety of people and visit a variety of places. I have been in contact with diggers, cavers, lovers of abandoned and crazy seekers of truth. I have been in the most creepy and gloomy places of the capital and the region. And I always calmly observed and remembered everything that happened around me. But at some point, what was happening in the editorial office began to worry me. First there were smells. They were strongest in the lobby. The smell of raw concrete and... it's like someone hasn't taken out the waste for a week. Such a faint smell of rot. I was a little surprised. It seems that our cleaners are conscientious, and the smell of concrete should have worn off long ago. During the day, he was almost invisible, only in the evenings, when no one was in the building. Then the communications went wild. Then the light bulb would blink or go out completely, so that after a while it would spontaneously light up. Then the phone at the far end of the hall would suddenly ring. It won't ring, but it will ring. I tried not to listen and not to look closely. Usually I was so immersed in my work that my fingers were tangled and I didn't notice anything behind the clatter of the keyboard. My thoughts overtook one another. But there were also slips. During one of these, I heard sounds. Quiet tapping or patting on something hard. Dimensional, and at the same time it was not the dimension of a car or a metronome. There was an irregularity in this dimension, as if the source of the sounds was someone alive. They were very quiet, almost inaudible at first. But sometimes I froze at the computer in search of a suitable phrase, and felt goosebumps creep up my spine from these sounds. Apparently, I'm not that stupid. And I decided that's it, I don't spend the night in the editorial office anymore. Naturally, I didn't announce this to anyone. And, as luck would have it, almost immediately I received a task for one urgent report, which had to be handed over to the layout room. Time was running out, and I decided to go out into the night for the last time. The material, as they say, walked by myself. While I was walking to the editorial office, I came up with the plot and how I organized the text. It remains only to rat it out. Words and phrases flew from under my fingers, and I was distracted only in order to save what I had written. I got so carried away that I forgot about the sounds and smells. And suddenly the computer blinked and rebooted. I managed to think only about an unsaved piece of text I will have to type again. Then a dull needle of anxiety suddenly pricked under my heart, and anxiety squeezed my throat. I really wanted to drop everything and get out of here as soon as possible. I'll finish it tomorrow, I decided, and already reached out to press the power button. But I didn't have time. White tables on a black background ran, and then suddenly a terrible face appeared. Out of respect for the deceased, it is necessary to say dead face, but the first thought was exactly that, I will not lie. It was not a screamer, not a picture, although the face did not move. It was as if the surveillance camera installed in the morgue was showing me this. It was literally imprinted in my head. Male, swollen, with staring blurry eyes, with streaks of blood, with the tip of a black tongue between bare teeth. And it seemed to me, freezing with horror, that it also sees me, which signals me about something. I caught up and rushed out. I don't remember how I rolled down the steps. I didn't even turn to the elevator, crossed the lobby in a few jumps and flew out into the street like a bullet. Already outside the doors, he froze, listening. The wind rustled softly in the lime trees behind the fence. Cars were rushing along the highway not far away. A small electronic beep sounded next to me, and I shuddered. But it turned out to be my watch, which marked the beginning of each hour with a signal. This spurred me on, and I rushed at top speed to the house. This was the only time I covered the distance from work to home in 12 minutes. By some miracle, escaping from the office, I picked up my city backpack. Apparently, this was affected by a habit brought to automatism. I'm nowhere without a faithful friend as scapegoat. Otherwise I would have been cooing the rest of the night in the entrance. There were keys in my backpack. The next morning I came to the editorial office later than everyone else intentionally, although I risked my reputation and money if I didn't deliver the report on time. Everything was casual, only my computer glowed with a screensaver. Not without fear, I approached him. Nothing unusual, scary or strange, just the Windows desktop. I quickly got the text out and managed to cram it into the layout number. During the lunch break, the sysadmin and I checked my computer for viruses. There were none, as I expected, and I whispered to him about the nightmare vision. Since there was nothing else to do in the editorial office, I asked to go home, but instead went to a friend. Together we tried to find out something about the place where our office center stood. The building itself was beyond suspicion. Nothing, no dark stories, no desecrated cemeteries, houses with a bloody history. I dug both this way and that dully. The solution came by itself after a couple of weeks. Arriving at work at the usual time, I now spent the night exclusively at home. I found our entire editorial office to the last person on the landing in front of the doors. The building was cordoned off by the police. No one was allowed inside. It turned out that our developer was a major criminal shark. During the construction, he simply laundered money earned by drugs and racketeering. He and his brigade used the basements of buildings under construction as dungeons and torture chambers for debtors and competitors, and those who could not pay were killed right there and hid their bodies in concrete. The uncomplicated columns in the lobby were not load-bearing. This, if I may say so, decorative element contained the corpses of those with whom the developer, as if to put it mildly, had major disagreements. Later, I was confidentially told the names of those whose mortal remains were immured in concrete. They were all the same criminals and freaks as their executioner. Although I'm afraid there were decent people among his victims, too. The dashing 90s. A terrible and violent time of my youth.